Passage 1, Literary Narrative. This passage, which includes an essay by Angie Cruz, is adapted from the unattributed article First Addresses Seared in Memory. In the full article First Addresses Seared in Memory, several established writers respond to the quotation from Breakfast at Tiffany's by exploring how their first apartments influenced them as writers. In the introduction to his 1958 novella, Breakfast at Tiffany's, no less a luminary than Truman Capote wrote of his first New York apartment, a one-room apartment in a brownstone in the East 70s. The walls were stucco and a color rather like tobacco spit. Everywhere in the bathroom too, there were prints of Roman ruins freckled brown with age. A single window looked out on a fire escape. Even so, my spirits heightened whenever I felt in my pocket the key to this apartment. With all its gloom, it still was a place of my own. The first, and my books were there, and jars of pencils to sharpen, everything I needed, so I felt, to become the writer I wanted to be. With housing costs throughout the city more prohibitive than ever, acquiring one's first New York apartment is a far more daunting task than it was even a decade ago. But there is no question that the experience of one's first place in the city is a transforming rite of passage. Angie Cruz remembers hers. In 1997, I returned to the city from college upstate to study creative writing at New York University and found a sublet in my old neighborhood, Washington Heights. It was a steal, $600 a month, for an L-shaped one-bedroom in a pre-war building at 615 West 164th Street. All the apartments faced the courtyard, and as if watching a stage from a production booth, I saw my relatives and longtime neighbors across the way from my second-floor window. Because I wanted color and to hide the defects on the walls, I painted the bedroom an oceanic blue, the living room the color of a mango, the bathroom a leaf green. The apartment bore signs of its past and wasn't perfect. The dumbwaiter had been turned into a pantry. The kitchen cabinets didn't close all the way, and the wooden floors were hidden by beige industrial tiles. Then there were the plumbing ghosts. My toilet flushed randomly all by itself, and the sink in the kitchen filled up with bubbles when the lady upstairs did her wash. I woke up in the morning with the sunlight, and from my kitchen window, I often greeted my grandmother, who lived across the courtyard, her asking me, "Are you still studying up there?" That had been my explanation when she asked me why didn't I have a job with good benefits. Estudiando is the one word that magically answered all the questions from my relatives when I locked myself up and didn't pick up the phone, even when they saw that my light was on. "We are estudiando," I said when my relatives stood at my front door holding plastic containers filled with dinner and saw a group of women crowded in the living room plotting an event, discussing politics, sharing their writing. Although my apartment was a snug 500 square feet filled with books, museum posters, and my very bad but honest figurative paintings, the rooms seemed to swell in size when other writers needed a place to stay. And so my apartment was often full of people coming and going, cramped with additional desks and beds for short-term stays. There was always a fresh batch of iced tea in the fridge, an answering machine to answer my calls, photographs on my desk of all the people I love. The wooden and ceramic dolls I collected from different parts of the world watched over my laptop. My desk faced the courtyard, a neglected garden overgrown with weeds. In the late afternoon, I could see if my sassy grandmother was home from her job at the lamp factory in New Jersey, and when the radio next door wasn't at full blast, I could hear my aunt, who also lived across the courtyard, yelling after my teenage nephew from her window. There were also moments when it was quiet, when kids were at school, people were at work, and the meringue-loving neighbors were taking their afternoon siesta. In one of those rare quiet moments, I remember having a revelation while staring at a draft of my first novel on my desk that if I had waited to tell my story until I had a room of my own, as opposed to a place that always brimmed with people, I would have never finished that novel. But even more so, without all the family members who showed up with leftovers and slipped $20 in my hand when I looked tired from long nights had freelance jobs, teaching, editing, and even window designing while estudiando for my master's degree, I wouldn't have had the confidence that I was right to continue to live my life as a writer. It was the spirit of all that collective activity inside that apartment with elastic walls that gave birth to my first novel. Okay, as presented in the passage, Capote's and Cruz's attitude towards the condition of their apartment can best be described as similar. They were both disappointed in their old, shabby apartments. Similar, the apartment's defects didn't keep them from appreciating their apartments. Different, Capote was disappointed in his apartment's shabbiness, whereas Cruz felt at home, and Capote felt at home, whereas Cruz was disappointed. So you can see here that when we say that there was a bloom, but it was still a place of my home. So Capote for sure felt that this was a place he could belong to, right? And here you can see that I wanted color, and to hide the defects on the walls, I painted the bedroom. So she definitely felt the need to change it. So their attitudes were different. So D is the answer. Details in the passage indicate that compared to Cruz's first apartment, Capote's first apartment was somewhat larger, had less natural light, was in a different city, had a clearer view. Okay, so here it says L-shaped one bedroom. All the apartments face the courtyard. I saw my relatives. What about him? There were prints of Roman ruins. The single window looked out on a fire escape, right? So the view was only of a fire escape in Capote's case. So it had, Capote's first apartment had less natural light. The primary writing mode of Cruz's essay is descriptive. She uses imagery and specific details. Narrative, she recounts the main events of her writing career. Persuasive, she uses events from her life to argue that family support systems are crucial. And expository, she explains how to thrive in a flawed apartment. So it's not D, and it's not the main events of her writing career. She does use specific details, right? So it is descriptive. And I don't think that it is using events from her life to argue that. That's kind of an exaggerated option. So A. The main idea of the ninth paragraph is that Cruz's apartment was 62 to 72. Although my apartment was a snug 500 square feet, the rooms seemed to swell in size when other writers needed a place to stay, and so my apartment was often full of people. So it was too small and cluttered, a hospitable, welcoming place despite its clutter and small size. The main function of the 10th paragraph, 73 to 82, the wooden and ceramic dolls I collected from different parts of the world watched over my laptop. Okay. Analyze the relationship Cruz had with her grandmother. Explain how these influenced her writing. Depict the sights and sounds Cruz encountered while at her desk. Yeah. Which of the following statement best captures Cruz's revelation as it is presented in 86 to 92? But even more so, I was right to continue. It was the spirit of, for Cruz, a quiet, solitary place to write wasn't available and may not have been helpful. Cruz was opposed to the idea that a room full of people, for Cruz, writing came most easily. Yeah, so a quiet, solitary place wasn't available and may not have been helpful. According to the passage, without her family members, Cruz wouldn't have obtained a college degree, felt confident about her career choice, been able to pay rent, continued her freelance teaching jobs. So without all the family members, I wouldn't have had the confidence that I was right to continue. So she wouldn't have felt confident about her career choice. According to the passage, acquiring an apartment in New York has become more daunting because apartments have become more expensive, right? This is here. Yeah. with housing costs throughout the city more prohibitive, right? According to Crew, she returned to the city to be near family, finish her novel, study creative writing. Yeah, so it's study creative writing, correct? She returned to the city to study creative writing. Based on the passage, Cruz considered the rent she paid for her apartment um, to be lower than that of similar apartments, right? It was a steal for a one bedroom. Yeah, so lower than that. Okay, I just wanted to revisit question one because there were defects. I painted the bedroom, but the apartment bore signs of its past, the kitchen cabinets. Yeah, so I think their attitudes were similar. The defects did not keep them from appreciating. So I'll go with B here, right? Passage 2, social science. This passage is adapted from the book The Disappearing Spoon by Sam Keane. Aluminum is the British spelling of aluminum. Okay. A number of brilliant chemists devoted their careers to aluminum throughout the 1800s, and it's hard to judge whether the element was better or worse off afterward. A Danish chemist and a German chemist simultaneously extracted this metal from the ancient astringent alum around 1825. Alum is the powder cartoon character like Sylvester, the cat, sometimes swallow that makes their mouths pucker. Okay, it's the powder cartoon characters sometimes swallow that makes their mouths pucker. Because of its luster, mineralogists immediately classified aluminum as a precious metal like silver or platinum, worth hundreds of dollars an ounce. 20 years later, a Frenchman figured out how to scale up these methods for industry, making aluminum available commercially for a price. It was still more expensive than even gold. That's because despite being the most common metal in the Earth's crust, around 8% of it by weight, hundreds of millions of times more common than gold, aluminum never appears in pure mother lode aluminum form. It's always bonded to something, usually oxygen. Pure samples were considered miracles. The French once displayed Fort Knox-like aluminum bars next to their crown jewels, and the minor Emperor Napoleon III reserved a prized set of aluminum cutlery for special guests at banquets. Less favored guests used gold knives and forks. In the US, government engineers, to show off their country's industrial prowess, capped the Washington Monument with a 6-pound pyramid of aluminum in 1884. A historian reports that 1 ounce of shavings from the pyramid would have paid a day's wages for each of the laborers who erected it. Aluminum's 60-year reign as the world's most precious substance was glorious, but soon an American chemist ruined everything. The metal's properties, light, strong, attractive, tantalized manufacturers, and its omnipresence in the Earth's crust had the potential to revolutionize metal production. It obsessed people, but no one could figure out an efficient way to separate it from oxygen. At Oberlin College in Ohio, a chemistry professor named Frank Fanning Jewett would regale his students with tales of the aluminum El Dorado that awaited whoever mastered this element. And at least one of his students had the naivety to take his professor seriously. In his later years, Professor Jewett bragged to old college chums that my greatest discovery was the discovery of a man, Charles Hall. Hall worked with Jewett on separating aluminum throughout his undergraduate years at Oberlin. He failed and failed and failed again, but failed a little more smartly each time. Finally, in 1886, Hall ran an electric current from handmade batteries, power lines didn't exist, through a liquid with dissolved aluminum compounds. The energy from the current zapped and liberated the pure metal, which collected in minute silver nuggets on the bottom of the tank. The process was cheap and easy, and it would work just as well in huge vats as on the lab bench. This had been the most sought after chemical prize since the Philosopher's Stone, and Hall had found it. The aluminum boy wonder was just 23. Hall's fortune, however, was not made instantly. Chemist Paul Héroult in France stumbled on more or less the same process at the same time. Today, Hall and Héroult share credit for the discovery that crashed the aluminum market. An Austrian invented another separation method in 1887, and with the competition bearing down on Hall, he quickly founded what became the Aluminum Company of America, or Alcoa, in Pittsburgh. It turned into one of the most successful business ventures in history. Aluminum production at Alcoa grew at exponential rates. In its first months in 1888, Alcoa eked out 50 pounds of aluminum per day. 2 decades later, it had to ship 88,000 pounds per day to meet the demand. And while production soared, prices plummeted. Years before Hall was born, one man's breakthrough had dropped aluminum from $5.50 per pound to $18 per pound in 7 years. 50 years later, not even adjusting for inflation, Hall's company drove down the price to 25 cents per pound. And thanks to Hall, aluminum became the utterly blasé metal we all know, the basics for pop cans and pinging little league bats and airplane bodies. A little anachronistically, it still sits atop the Washington Monument too. I suppose it depends on your taste and temperament whether you think aluminum was better off as the world's most precious or most productive metal. Okay, the passage can be described as evaluation of Hall and his company's effects on the world economy, assessment of major discoveries in chemistry during the 19th century, overview of how perception of aluminum's value changed and Hall's role in that change, argument that aluminum should still be considered a precious metal. So I think C, right? Because the majority of the passage is about Hall and about the overview of how aluminum's value changed. Based on the passage, the author would most likely agree with which of the following statements. It is unclear why aluminum was originally classified as being similar to metals. It is uncertain whether mineralogists or chemists were ultimately more responsible for the widespread use of aluminum. There is no clear evidence for why aluminum's price dropped substantially before Hall began experimenting. It's difficult to definitively judge whether aluminum's status was bettered or worsened by the attention it received in the 1800s. So I think it's the last option, right? A number of brilliant chemists devoted their careers, and it's hard to judge whether the element was better or worse off afterward. So it's difficult to judge whether its status was bettered or worsened because it went from precious to productive. In the context of the passage, what does the author most nearly mean when he says that an American chemist ruined everything? Hall was the first to discover how to extract pro-aluminum from the Earth's crust. Hall made aluminum commercially available to manufacturers for a very high price. Hall's work with aluminum quickly stripped it of its status as a rare and precious metal. Hall founded his company in the US long before other countries had the tools. So it's C, right? He kind of took away that status that aluminum had. In the passage, which of the following individuals or groups is presented as believing in Jewett's aluminum El Dorado? So, yeah, so it was the El Dorado that awaited whoever mastered this element. At least one of his students had the naivety. So it's Hall, right? The main point of the fourth paragraph, 45 to 60. So he bragged to his, in this talks about how Hall came to discover, right? Hall failed for years in his experimentation. He found an ideal solution to a confounding problem. Jewett's experiments led to a major discovery. Despite its success, Hall's breakthrough wasn't initially practical. So he found an ideal solution for a confounding problem. Yeah, right. So that would be the right answer. That's the main point. The passage indicates that Hall moved quickly to found Alcoa because other scientists' work was rapidly beginning to rival his own. He much preferred developing a business to studying chemistry. His professors were pressuring him to begin producing aluminum commercially. He wanted to distance himself from Herod. So it was due to competitive pressure, right? Right here, it's given that with the competition bearing down on him, he quickly founded Alcoa. Right. The author most likely includes the information about Napoleon III primarily to illustrate how commonplace gold had become. So Napoleon III is here. Yeah. And the minor emperor Napoleon III reserved a prize set of aluminum cutlery. So, highlight the extravagant wealth of the French royalty, emphasize just how highly esteemed aluminum once was. So, it's C. According to the passage, the Washington Monument was capped with a pyramid of aluminum because the pyramid's high cost was meant to symbolize the overall value of the monument. Aluminum was a commonly used building material. US engineers wanted to outdo the lavish displays of wealth put on by French royalty. The US government wanted to flaunt the US's industrial might. So it comes from here. In the United States government, engineers wanting to show off their country's industrial prowess. So J. The passage indicates that before Hall's discovery, manufacturers were interested in using aluminum in part because of the metals. So this comes from here. The metal's properties, its properties tantalized manufacturers, right? So because of the metal's strength, right? Was it strength? Yeah, strength. The author most likely uses the word stumbled to suggest that. Line 62. Chemist Paul Heroult stumbled on more or less the same process. So accidentally came upon it. The mistakes Hall made in his initial experiments were later remedied. Heroult's discovery may have been more accidental than intentional. Right? He stumbled upon. Okay. Passage 3, paired passage, humanities. Passage A is adapted from the article Dylan's Electric Kiss-Off by Damien Cave. Passage B is adapted from American popular music, The Rock Years, by Larry Starr and Christopher Waterman. Passage A by Damien Cave. The most notorious live performance in rock and roll lasted about 15 minutes. 3 songs played at a saltive volume by a plugged-in blues band fronted by the young poet king of American folk music at the sacred annual Congress of Acoustic Purists, the Newport Folk Festival. In that quarter hour on the warm Sunday evening of July 25th, 1965, at Free Body Park in Newport, Rhode Island, Bob Dylan, 24, backed by the electric Chicago charge of the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, declared his independence from the orthodoxy of the folk scene and publicly unveiled his rock and roll heart. Dylan paid for his daring. Some witnesses claimed that he left the stage in tears, shocked by the shouting and heckling from several members of the Newport audience, before going back out to do penance, 2 acoustic numbers. Butterfield guitarist Mike Bloomfield said Dylan looked really shook up, but Al Cooper, who joined the Butterfield band that fateful night as guest organist, insisted that the catcalls are a myth. It wasn't boo, 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 it was more, more, more. When Dylan walked on stage at Newport, dressed in black pants and a green shirt, it was the first time he had appeared in public with an electric guitar since his days with his Minnesota high school combo. A month before Newport, Dylan cut his first top 5 hit, Like a Rolling Stone, in New York with a group that included Cooper and Bloomfield. Yet Dylan's first performance that weekend at a Newport workshop on Saturday was a pair of older folk songs. There's no apparent booing on the surviving soundboard tape of the show. There is yelling. It has been suggested that the audience was complaining about the sound mix. Folk icon Pete Seeger admitted he was so enraged by Dylan's set he wanted to chop the microphone cord, but only because Dylan's voice was so distorted. On the tape, Dylan is front center and bitingly clear. The crowd was mostly upset because Dylan, the top attraction at Newport, was on and off stage in less time than it took some folkies to sing a ballad. He was so rattled when he returned alone to sing It's All Over Now, Baby Blue and Mr. Tambourine Man that he had the wrong harmonica for the latter song. Does anybody have an E harmonica? Anybody? He asked the crowd. Just throw them all up. He got one. The folk scene never recovered, rock and roll was never the same, and Dylan knew he was responsible. Okay. In passage A, the words sacred and purist most nearly serve to characterize the Newport Folk Festival and its attendees as drawn to songs containing moral lessons, driven to discover unknown musicians, devoted to the genre of folk music dedicated to Dylan's career. So they were devoted to the genre of folk music. They were absolutely, they believed in the purity of folk music. They felt that it should not be fiddled with, right? So this is sacred and purists. The information about Dylan's guitar in 23 to 26 primarily serves to: when Dylan walked on stage at Newport, dressed in black pants and a green shirt, it was the first time he had appeared in public with an electric green guitar. Right. So outline the development of Dylan's style of guitar playing, contribute to an account of Dylan's rise to fame, emphasize that Dylan switched instruments throughout his career, establish that fans were unaccustomed to Dylan playing electric guitar. So I think it would be D, right? Because it was the first time he had appeared with an electric guitar. Um, a month before Newport, Dylan cut his first top 5 hit with a group that where Dylan's first performance that weekend was a pair of older folk songs. So it was the first time he had appeared in public with an electric guitar. So yeah, fans were unaccustomed to him playing the electric guitar. According to passage A, Dylan had the wrong harmonica because he hadn't planned on playing that song. Seeger had tampered with Dylan's equipment. He was flustered by the crowd's response. He wasn't used to switching instruments, right? So he was flustered, right? We know that he looked shook up, and so he probably did not get the right harmonica because of that. Okay, passage B. Why was there such a shock wave produced by the concept of Bob Dylan as a rock and roll star? It probably had to do with the differing cultural roles assigned by most people to urban folk music on the one hand and rock and roll on the other. Urban folk in the early 1960s was an increasingly topical, political, socially conscious music. Even the singing of traditional folk songs often carried with it a subtext of political identification with labor, with the poor, with minority groups, and other people seen as oppressed, with a movement for international peace and understanding, depending on the nature and origins of the particular songs chosen. Thus, the words were of paramount importance in urban folk music, and the acoustic guitar accompaniments enabled the words to be heard clearly. Besides, acoustic guitars were easily portable, readily accessible, and presented no elaborate barrier between performers and audiences. It was a relatively simple matter to bring an acoustic guitar along to a political meeting or demonstration and to set it up and play it there when and if the occasion presented itself, which surely cannot be said of rock and roll band equipment. And of course, rock and roll was identified as a fun music, a music to accompany dancing and other socializing, whose lyric content was by definition light, amusing, sometimes clever, often generic, but virtually never serious. By the mid 1960s, changes within rock and roll were already in the wind, but Bob Dylan's electric style and other manifestations of folk rock had the effect of an enormous injection of growth hormones into the pop music scene. Suddenly, it was all right, expected even, for rock and roll to be as adult as its baby boomer audience was now becoming itself, and rock and roll abruptly grew up into rock. Pop records on serious subjects with political and poetical lyrics sprang up everywhere. Before long, this impulse carried over into the making of ambitious concept albums. The later 1960s flowered into a period of intense and remarkable innovation and creativity in pop music. Okay. In the context of passage B, the list between the dashes in lines 58 to 61 can best be described as examples of people and causes that. So this one with labor, so on. So these were the causes that folk songs identified with, right? Folk music sympathized with. Yeah. In line 86, the phrase this impulse most specifically refers to the before long, this impulse carried over into the making of ambitious concept albums. Suddenly, it was all right for rock and roll to be as adult as its baby boomer audience was now becoming itself. Pop records on serious subjects sprang up everywhere. So, this impulse was to shift from political to poetical lyrics, ambitiousness of albums, swift displacement of folk music, increased seriousness of pop music, right? So there was an increased seriousness to pop music. As used in line 66, the word presented most nearly means. Besides, acoustic guitars were easily portable and presented no elaborate barrier. They posed no elaborate barrier. Which of the following statements provides the best paraphrase of lines 77 to 81? These lines, by the mid 1960s, changes within rock and roll were already in the wind, but Bob Dylan's electric style and other manifestations of folk rock had the effect of an enormous injection of growth hormones into the pop music scene. Innovations within rock and roll enticed Dylan and others like him. Rock and roll's popularity grew as a result of the increasing appeal of electric instruments. Dylan's genre-crossing approach spurred development in rock and roll. Rock and roll merged with folk music to become a genre called folk rock. So we know that it was his electric style and other manifestations of folk rock. So he was kind of working across genres, right? So C. Which of the following statements best captures a main difference in the focus of the two passages? Passage A focuses on describing the Newport Folk Festival, while passage B focuses on comparing the popularity of folk music to the popularity of rock and roll. Passage A focuses on analyzing Dylan's popularity, while passage B focuses on questioning why Dylan switched. So it's not G. Passage A focuses on defending Dylan's decision to play rock and roll at Newport, while passage B focuses on reflecting on rock and roll's increasingly ambitious sophistication in the 1960s. Passage A focuses on portraying Dylan's rock and roll performance at the Newport Festival, while passage B focuses on exploring the roles of and changes within folk music and rock and roll in the 1960s. So I think I like J because it portrays his performance. It gives you Dylan's performance, right? So it's better than A because it is not describing the festival, it's describing Dylan, right? And I don't think he defends. I think he presents a neutral view on Dylan's performance. And passage B obviously looks at the roles and changes that were happening to folk music, right? Yeah. So I would say, is it defense? So I'll just quickly look at this. When Dylan walked on stage, yes, I think it's neutral. I also want to see if the roles and changes within folk music and rock and roll, or is it just, yeah, so it's basically pop music. So J is better. With which of the following claims would the authors of both passages agree? Dylan's conversion from folk musician to rock and roll temporarily stalled his career. Dylan's rock and roll performance at the Newport marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of rock and roll. The response of Dylan's rock and roll performance left Dylan confused about the course of his development. Changes within rock and roll motivated Dylan to switch from playing folk music to rock and roll. So I think B is definitely true for the first one. I'm just going to look at, yeah, even the second one would kind of say that, Bob Dylan did have a pivotal role to play. I'm just going to say Dylan's rock and roll marked the pivotal movement. Okay. Yeah, so I'll go with B. Compared to passage A, passage B provides more information about pre-1960s history, lyrics in folk music, Dylan's public persona, Dylan's background. So, urban folk in the early 1960s, even the singing, I think the lyrics, because the words were of paramount importance in urban folk music. Yeah, so it would be the lyrics. in folk music and rock and roll. It wasn't the pre-1960s history because it's in the early 1960s. Yeah, so I'll go with G. Passage 4, Natural Science. This passage is adapted from the article The Hearing of the Barn Owl by Eric Knudsen. For the barn owl, life depends on hearing. A nocturnal hunter, the bird must be able to find field mice solely by the rustling and squeaking sounds they make as they traverse runways in snow or grass. Like predators that hunt on the ground, the barn owl must be able to locate its prey quickly and precisely in the horizontal plane. Since the bird hunts from the air, it must also be able to determine its angle of elevation above the animal it is hunting. The owl has solved this problem very successfully. It can locate sounds in azimuth, the horizontal dimension, and elevation, the vertical dimension, better than any other animal whose hearing has been tested. What accounts for this acuity? The answer lies in the owl's ability to utilize subtle differences between the sound in its left ear and that in its right. The ears are generally at slightly different distances from the source of a sound, so that sound waves reach them at slightly different times. The barn owl is particularly sensitive to these minute differences, exploiting them to determine the azimuth of the sound. In addition, the sound is perceived as being somewhat louder by the ear that is closer to the source, and this difference offers further clues to the horizontal location. For the barn owl, the difference in loudness also helps to specify elevation because of an unusual asymmetry in the owl's ears. The right ear and its opening are directed slightly upward. The left ear and its opening are directed slightly downward. For this reason, the right ear is more sensitive to sounds from above and the left ear to sounds from below. These differences in timing and loudness provide enough information for the bird to accurately locate sounds both horizontally and vertically. To be of service to the owl, however, the information must be organized and interpreted. Much of the processing is accomplished in brain centers near the beginning of the auditory pathway. From these centers, nerve impulses travel to a network of neurons in the midbrain that are arranged in the form of a map of space. Each neuron in this network is excited only by sounds from one small region of space. From this structure, impulses are relayed to the higher brain centers. The selection of sensory cues and their transformation into a map of space is what enables the barn owl to locate its prey in total darkness with deadly accuracy. The most visually striking anatomical feature of the barn owl, and the one that plays the most important role in its location of prey, is the face. The skull is relatively narrow and small, and the face is large and round, made up primarily of layers of stiff, dense feathers arrayed in tightly packed rows. The feathered structure, called the facial ruff, forms a surface that is a very efficient reflector of high frequency sounds. Two troughs run through the ruff from the forehead to the lower jaw, each about 2 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters long. The troughs are similar in shape to the fleshy exterior of the human ear, and they serve the same purpose: to collect high-frequency sounds from a large volume of space and funnel them into the ear canals. The troughs join below the beak. The ear openings themselves are hidden under the preoral flaps, two flaps of skin that project to the side next to the eyes. The entire elaborate facial structure is hidden under a layer of particularly fine feathers that are acoustically transparent. The barn owl is capable of locating the source of a sound within a range of 1 to 2 degrees in both azimuth and elevation. 1 degree is about the width of a little finger at arm's length. Surprisingly, until the barn owl was tested, man was the species with the greatest known ability to locate the source of a sound. Human beings are about as accurate as the owl in azimuth, but are 3 times worse in elevation. The sensitivity of the barn owl's hearing is shown both by its capacity to locate distant sounds and by its ability to orient its talons for the final strike. When the owl swoops down on a mouse, even in a completely dark experimental chamber, it quickly aligns its talons with the body axis of the mouse. This behavior is not accidental. When the mouse turns and runs in a different direction, the owl realigns its talons accordingly. This behavior clearly increases the probability of a successful strike. It also implies that the owl not only identifies the location of the sound source with extreme accuracy, but also detects subtle changes in the origin of the sound, from which it infers the direction of movement of the prey. The first paragraph most strongly suggests that a barn owl must be able to locate sounds in the vertical dimension, mainly because it hunts. So it is a nocturnal hunter, right? It hunts at the night, and so it should be able to, uh, because it hunts from the air, even when it can only partially see the animals that move quickly while detecting sounds. So even when it can only partially see the animal, right? Because it's a nocturnal hunter. The author uses the expression, I'm just going to reread this, a nocturnal hunter, yeah, solely by hearing the sounds. The author uses the expression the azimuth of the sound most clearly to refer to a sound's fluctuation, location in the horizontal dimension, right? Azimuth is horizontal. As used in line 20, the word exploiting most nearly means the barn owl is particularly sensitive to these differences, exploiting them to determine the azimuth of the sound. Making use of these differences. Which of the following behaviors of a barn owl does the author provide as the strongest evidence of the bird's ability to detect subtle changes in the origin of a sound? Locating sound originating from small prey, catching prey in complete darkness, realigning its talons as a mouse turns and runs, swooping down on a stationary prey. So I think it also implies, but also detects subtle changes in the origin of the sound because of the movement of the prey. So yeah, realigning its talons as a mouse turns and runs. The passage indicates that each neuron in the network of neurons in the barn owl's midbrain is excited only by sounds. Okay, so each neuron in the network, right? The information must be organized. Much of the processing from these nerve impulses, each neuron is excited only by sound from one small region of space. From one small region of space. The author's use of the word deadly most nearly refers to 45 deadly accuracy, which means that it's completely accurate. Hint that the barn owl's method of attack is sometimes harmful, imply that the barn owl's prowess is both alarming and regrettable, reiterate that the barn owl is feared by many animals, emphasize that the barn owl's means of hunting is both remarkable and lethal. Yeah, so this is J. The author directly states that which of the following features is the most visually striking. So that comes here. The most visually striking feature is the face. Its face. According to the passage, in terms of length and width, a barn owl's troughs are. Okay, so this is, the troughs are mentioned here. Two troughs run through the ruff from the forearm, each about 2 centimeters wide and 9 centimeters long. So they are longer than they are wide. They are longer than they are wide. The author most likely refers to the feathers that cover the barn owl's facial structure as being acoustically transparent to emphasize that the feathers are shaped into two flaps that protect the owl's ear openings, arranged in several layers that allow sound to be amplified, textured and dense enough to block unnecessary stimuli, fine enough to allow them to sound to pass through them unfiltered. They're acoustically transparent, so they don't disturb the sound. Based on the passage, which of the following statements most accurately compares a human's ability to locate the source of a sound in azimuth and elevation? So in azimuth, it's the same, right? Human beings are about as accurate in azimuth, but 3 times worse in elevation. is about as accurate, 3 times more accurate in elevation. So F, no, no, so it's F. Yeah. Okay, so that was the reading section. Let's grade it. Starting from question 1. I'll just pull up the answer key. Yeah. So we have question 1. BGAGC, BGAGC, 6th FBJDF, FBJDF. Question 11, CJCJB, CJCJB, 16, FCJAG, FCJAG. Okay. Passage 3rd, 21, CJCFD, CJCFD. 26, GCJBG, GCJBG. And 31, AGDH. 31 is A. Okay, so 31 is A. GDHB, GDHB. 36, JCGDF, JCGDF. Okay, so we got 31 wrong. It hunts from the air, that's true. I don't think we are speaking of its ability to see, right? Like predators that hunt on the ground, the barn owl must be able to locate its prey. Since the bird hunts from the air, it must also be able to determine its angle of elevation, right? So I know that it's a nocturnal hunter, but the idea of it not being able to see the animal is not brought up. And A is directly mentioned, so that's better.